Here we are once again. For those who are uninitiated, we call this monthly series Media India 2014. Well, it has a very simple significance. It doesn't have to be about media, it's about medium. It's a conversation. People ask me why are you starting this? I tell them that, number one, I want people to know about Consulate. Number two, I want them to come inside. Number three, I want them to start new conversations. Number four, I want them to wonder why New York Times writes the articles of the type it writes. I want them to think as to why the multiple achievements of Indian democracy have not been highlighted, and why does it have to be always the pitfalls that need to be, brought into one full page or 3/4 of the page on a continuous basis. So let's talk on various topics. That was really the idea behind this. But this is not the only flagship series that we have. We introduced a number of new experiments. This Consulate is all about new experiments. We have started taking interns in the Consulate for the first time. We are currently engaging into making two coffee table books. One on the Consulate itself, giving its history, past achievements, history of the building. We also started Consulate store for children and students, but even adult students are welcome, or adult children are also welcome. The idea is to really get out of the Consulate or get people inside the Consulate, whichever is possible. We have a number of other things also going on, but among the important ones again is the media, India state by state is going to be our next flagship project. Every month we'll be showcasing one Indian state in the Consulate, which means if somebody is from Assam, the Consulate for a month should look like Assam. And the Assamese, this is a challenge to the Assamese community, that 1 month they should have as many events on Assam as possible at the Consulate. If it's a month of Rajasthan, Rajasthan will showcase its art, culture, economic achievements, tourism, whatever is the best that they have to offer to the world, they can showcase at the Consulate for as many days as they can. See, often community challenges me to do this and that. Now I have decided that time for me to challenge the community and its constructive, positive strength that is so much visible. So today we have part of this is the fifth lecture series, and we have what a distinguished panel we have here. There's nobody here who doesn't know Aziz Haniffa, and perhaps there's nobody here who also knows somebody who is once termed as the hottest woman.
By herself, but okay.
Wasn't that so?
It's in your website, yeah.
Yes, and these are all rightful claims. So, but the important is both of them are very much involved in media. Particularly Aziz, as it's been, he himself told me that he's a single man. But women, be aware, he's married to India abroad. So, is that right? Well, he is such a wonderful man. If there's really, our media is, multifaceted here. We have the print media, there's Indian Panorama, there's South Asian Reporter, there's something called Hi India. I hope there's no My India. And we have ITV and Asia TV and a number of other TV channels, PTV. But India abroad has its own place. It has made history, it has made us all very proud. And behind the success of this very powerful, equally is Mr. Aziz Haniffa, is the Managing Director of this prestigious V2. But yes, of course, we have, I hope you have seen this particular piece of paper as introduction, full introduction. Today we get him here as to speak on a topic that has at least agitated me. I don't know whether it has agitated you or not. We have a very powerful, empowered community here. And we have, somehow there is ethnic media. But there are other ethnic medias also. Perhaps you have Hispanic media, perhaps you have Jewish media, perhaps Chinese ethnic media. What's really the future? About 4.5 million Indians in this country. Other aspect is we have very powerful media people there. Aziz is just one person. We have people like Sri Srinivasan, Bobby Ghosh, Tilku Rajan, our friend from CNN, Farid Zakaria, any number of them. They're all proud Indians. They're also proud, many of them are proud Americans also. They're contributing not only to India and US alone, but also to the global events and happenings. My question is, how does this gel with the relationship that we want to see between India and US? How can they contribute? Are they contributing at all? Or are they just, really trying to look after that sense of gratification that all of us, diaspora, want to perpetuate when you are abroad? Some link with what's going on in India, some link with what's going on in our own community. Is it really incestuous affair? And is there any future? The way media is exploding overall, the print, the digital media, social network, where do we really stand? Number of issues, I'm sure. This is what we will handle, but he's of course free to look at the issues the way he wants to. He's of course an expert, and I'm a complete novice. Though occasionally I have written my columns. We have Mitra Kalita as Ideas Editor at Cards. Again, very erudite person. She also is teaching, has been teaching in Colombia. She has written extensively on the issues of diaspora and migration, and some of which I have had the pleasure of reading. This is going to be an important branch all over the world, because I think this unprecedented migration that is taking over, as access to communication improves, as the access to travel improves, and borders really become increasingly insignificant, despite the existence of nation states, as we know in the last 200 years. So she's again very happy. I think we couldn't have got a better person for moderating this event. Please give them a big hand. I'd like to welcome them. And this introduction will, after presentation of his keynote, we'll have discussion carried forward by Mitra, and thereafter we have a question answer, after which we'll all join us for a dinner. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. It's so wonderful to see so many old friends and new friends, and me amongst you all. I get into New York every once in a while, but it's always sort of a whistle stop to us, so it's wonderful to see all of you here. Ambassador Bule, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very interesting and innovative series that you have initiated. And kudos for you to being so proactive since you are posting in terms of convening such stimulating discussions, and also always being there for the community. And of course, we appreciate you being a constant presence at our India Abroad Person of the Year event. It's also a pleasure to have two of my very long time and dear friends, Mitra Kavita, formerly of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Mint in India, and now Ideas editor of Atlantic Media's Reports, which one of your early speakers, Bobby Ghosh, Time Magazine's international editor, has also recently joined. And Sri Srinivasan is supposed to be here, but anyway, he's the Chief Digital Officer at the Met, formerly journalism professor at Columbia University, and also the founder of the South Asian Journalists Association. And of course, been an inimitable MC for us for the last 10 years at our India Abroad events. By the way, if you all haven't read Mitra's two books, Suburban Sides and Two Indias, you guys don't know what you're missing, so I would strongly advise you to get it on Amazon and make it your summer reading. And that's a giant plug for Mitra, but of course when I finally get down to writing my book, I hope you return to it. Anyway, now to the topic that the ambassador had suggested that I addressed. Whether there is a role, and the role of ethnic media in terms of promoting US-India ties. Just at the outset, let me argue that more generally, the importance of the ethnic media today is almost a no-brainer. In 2003, the Carnegie Corporation brought out this report with a cover story saying New Americans fresh off the presses. And it focused on the importance of the ethnic media. And of course, the cover had a young lady reading an issue of India Abroad. And the lead story, the lead report, which said the reach and influence of the ethnic media in the United States continues to grow. Assimilation, acculturation, citizenship and news from home are only some of the subjects that ethnic media outlets present to millions of eager readers in dozens of different languages every day. And then of course they spoke about the more recent example in India Abroad, a colorful New York-based weekly owned by the Indian media conglomerate Rediff.com. India is a vast nation of many languages and cultures, but publications like India Abroad help cement emigres into a group made cohesive by their Indianness in America, as well as by their economic success. While some ethnic newspapers have as a central narrative the struggle of an oppressed people, that is their readers, this is peripheral to India Abroad, which focuses heavily on successful Indian Americans. Of course, this was written 30 years after India Abroad had been around. This was written in 2003, and Gopal Raju had launched and founded India Abroad in 1971. And I would dispute some of this because while we write about the success of Indian Americans, we also delve in a lot of huge issues, from immigration issues, from racial profiling, discrimination, etc. So it's a wide canvas that we have covered over the years. And the fact, when you talk about India Abroad, I must sort of give you a little bit of background, because India Abroad, like I said, it's been around for like 40 years now, and it was bought over by Rediff when this was written just 2 years after it was written. Gopal Raju was a real pioneer who founded India Abroad. And in a lot of ways, he blessed the purchase of India Abroad by Rediff because Adit Balakrishnan, the CEO of Rediff, and Nikhil Lakshman, the editor-in-chief, had pledged that they would continue his vision of India Abroad, being the voice of the Indian American community and promoting India-US relations with sort of quality journalism, credibility, and sort of objectivity. And of course, the sort of superb Rediff team has done just that, introducing a magazine section and also doing wonders in terms of the layout and graphics, not to mention the editorial content, and reinforcing the work of my editorial colleagues in the US, some of whom are here with us today. And I have to give a little background before I sort of jump into the issue of ethnic journalism and what a newspaper like India Abroad, which I'm going to make a case study, has done in terms of promoting India-US relations, as well as the Indian American community, and sort of empowering them in terms of the influence, the gravitas, and sort of the fact that they have become politically involved and politically empowered now. Raju established a beachhead 40 years ago by establishing and founding the first ever ethnic newspaper in the US. He came to the US, to the University of Michigan in the early 1950s, and being quite an entrepreneur, started a travel agency for international students. And then after graduating, he continued with this and he moved to New York and expanded his travel service and also launched India Abroad in 1971 to keep the then very small but growing Indian American community in the US apprised of what was going on in India. And even before I joined the newspaper, which was sort of in the early 80s, he had made his mark as a very feisty, tough, uncompromising publisher. In American terms, they would agreeably use the profanity that he was one tough son of a bitch. It was during the Indira Gandhi emergency when he refused to buckle down to pressure that he not publish articles by some of the Indian exiles, some of the NRIs and students who were critical of the emergency at the time. And just to be candid, I remember him relating how the ambassador at the time during the emergency, T.N. Cowell, who was called T. Cowell, had come to him and said that, Raju, like I said, was having this very successful travel agency, and then of course he had started India Abroad. T.N. Cowell had come to him and said that they don't appreciate some of the pieces that are appearing in India Abroad, which are very critical of Indira Gandhi's emergency, etc. And they had said, we can either make you a rich man or we can really make you suffer. And of course, for people over here who know Gopal Raju, I'm sure you all know what the answer was. He really told T.N. Cowell to take a hike. But this resulted in commissions that were owed him for his travel service being denied, with the result that his travel agency was completely crippled. And at that time, the growing Indian American community had put all their resources and given him all the support so that India Abroad could become the newspaper that it has. And in some ways, it helped India Abroad to expand even more in terms of readership and subscribers, because people had then flocked to Raju for taking the stand that he did. My involvement, like I said, began in the 1980s. Raju used to have sort of a New York Times staffer in Washington who was scribbling for him. But Raju was a pretty shrewd guy. He didn't want just rewrites of some press releases, but was looking for some young guy, and I was pretty young then, who could really hustle, run around, cover the State Department, White House, Congress, Pentagon, and Button lawmakers and all these guys. In some ways, ironically, he wanted to move the paper beyond simply sort of a parochial ethnic mold to become much more mainstream. And of course, earlier, being the stickler that he was for very good editing and language and wanting sort of a standard that could hold its own with the best of the mainstream newspapers, he had hired some retired New York Times copy editors, or sub-editors as we in South Asia call them, so that there could be a sort of standard and the language content and everything else that could, like I said, move away from simply sort of an ethnic mold. When I started in the 1980s, you've got to remember these were sort of the Cold War days, and India was getting a pretty bad rap, being viewed as a surrogate of the erstwhile Soviet Union. And trying to get interviews, trying to get stories, trying to cover Indo-US relations, let alone promote them through the newspaper, was sort of a very uphill battle. Every interview you did, both in the administration and in Congress, guys would always complain bitterly about India's foreign policy, non-alignment, etc. You've got to remember in the Cold War days, it was always a policy of the good guys and the bad guys. You guys were either with us, that is US, with us, you were the good guys. If you disagreed with us, you were the bad guys. But it was a lot of hustling, interviewing, buttonholing these guys, and at the same time covering the very growing, influential Indian American community, and writing reports on how this community was become empowered and politically involved, etc. In fact, I used to write so many reports that I used to joke that Raju quickly put me on salary because it was more economical than paying me by the word. And he quickly moved me into being permanent than being a spinner. But jokes apart, this was the beginning of the ethnic media promoting both a community that was being empowered and at the same time trying to bring a perspective to US-India relations beyond this Cold War prism that it had found itself held hostage to, and trying to get the Indian American community to become a critical mass in terms of offering this perspective. And like I said, since I'm making sort of India abroad sort of a case study of the topic that the ambassador spoke about in terms of how the ethnic media has helped in terms of promoting India-US relations, I would say the first example of that began when the Reagan administration was about to sell sophisticated F-16 airplanes to Pakistan, which was its Cold War ally at the time. You know, this was tremendous concern to India. But at the time, like I said, it was sort of you're either with us or you're without us. And so the Reagan administration was going ahead and going to be selling those planes to Pakistan. And at that time, there was, to you old-timers, all you remember, there used to be a New York Democrat called Stephen Solas, who was the chairman of the Asia Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was a Brooklyn Democrat whom Raju had cultivated and introduced to the Indian American community. And Solas, of course, he had his own vested interest also because he found that the Indian community could be a huge contributory base to his campaign coffers. At the same time, became sort of a one-man India caucus. And he would counter attack after attack that was being launched against India, particularly by Republicans, led by a congressman called Dan Burton, who was then sort of the darling of the Council of Khalistan and the Kashmiri American Council. And Burton would every year introduce anti-India amendments and try to get development aid cut to India. But through a sense of, I guess, sustained reporting as well as a community that was being empowered, Solas also started making these speeches on the House floor. And also India abroad doing some really tough interviews with the likes of Burton and all these India raters. The ethnic media started playing a catalytic role in trying to impress upon the importance of closer relations with a democracy like India instead of a dictatorship at the time which was in Pakistan. So quietly there was a sense in Congress among lawmakers and also sort of an evolving in the administration that it was quite ironic and quite a dichotomy that here was the US, of course, this is something that we can argue about foreign policy, that India was being given such a bad rap, but at the same time you have this close relationship with dictatorships. Of course, things began to evolve when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited Washington. And it was interesting that even at the time that India-US relations were not as good as people would have expected it to be, being two democracies, Reagan and Rajiv Gandhi got along so well, people used to describe it as sort of almost like a father-son relationship, etc. And interestingly, that was the time the real science and technology between India and the US really began to take form. Some people argue that it was more in the Bush administration and the nuclear deal that it happened, but it was really during that Rajiv-Reagan initiative that science and technology took off. And that was the beginnings of a strategic partnership that was to begin between Washington and Delhi. And fast forward to the nuclear deal between India and the US, which was transformative itself and further cemented the strategic partnership which began to take place really after President Clinton visited in March of 2000. Raju also supplemented India abroad by starting something called the India Abroad Center for Political Awareness. So here was the ethnic media and India Abroad, which had established itself, which was doing very well at the time, and Raju started this thing called the India Abroad Center for Political Awareness. This was where he started placing young Indian American college students as interns in Congress during the summer. And apart from the fact that it was giving Indian college students an opportunity to find out how government really worked, and more importantly, to also tell their parents how government really worked, and tell them that if you are making a contribution to a lawmaker or a congressman or a senator, don't just go by the fact that the guy says, oh, I introduced some legislation or I just joined the congressional caucus. See how that legislation moves from step one to become enacted as legislation. So it had sort of a twofold effort. And these students were in a way also helpful in bringing awareness to the Congress, many of whom really had no idea about US-India relations at the time or how important it was, and generally had to rely on some aides to just give them a brief about what was happening. These kids, these college kids, were able to bring about some sort of perspective on Capitol Hill. But of course, then, interestingly, the Pokhran nuclear test happened in May of 1998, just when this transformation was beginning, and it was on the verge of taking off in terms of India-US relations. And then, of course, the whole relationship took a nosedive. US imposed punitive sanctions, and once again, it was newspapers like India Abroad, and of course other newspapers also at the time, which had now been growing, India West, News India, etc., that was able to once again get community activists. And there was someone called Swadesh Chatterjee from North Carolina, who arranged for, at the time, meeting between External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh and also Jesse Helms, who was this rabid, right-wing North Carolina senator who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who was the guy who was going after India, imposing sanctions. And that meeting brought about some sort of understanding, even though not wholly. There were other guys saying, why did you arrange a meeting with a guy like, he was detested so much that there were people questioning why such a meeting was arranged. But in some ways, it was able to get this guy, Jesse Helms, to look at, to have some sort of a perspective in terms of why this nuclear test had happened, and that there was also the China factor there. There were strategic reasons for doing it. And in some ways, the mainstream media still at the time kept hammering India for this test and blaming India for triggering the almost back-to-back tit-for-tat test that Pakistan had. But then the ethnic media, in terms of trying to bring about some understanding, was able to give India's perspective, and through interviews with congressmen, senators, etc., were invaluable in terms of developing that strategic dialogue that started to take place with then Deputy Secretary of State Stuart Talbot and Jaswant Singh, which ultimately led to the envisaged strategic relationship that we see today. Now fast forward to the India-US nuclear deal. Then Ambassador Ronan Sen, who was in the forefront of pushing for the deal and to make the deal a reality, in fact used to tell guys like Swadesh Chatterjee and others, could you get Aziz to do some op-eds, can you get him to do some opinion pieces so that you can exhort the Indian American community to also come out in support of this deal and to lobby Congress to support the deal. Because it was not an easy deal, because you had more of the Republicans on board, and of course George W. Bush, the president, was pushing for the deal. But you had Democrats whom you would have thought would have looked favorably upon such a deal, but were such non-proliferation hawks that they didn't want nuclear reactors even in the US, let alone in India. And of course, India was not a party to the non-proliferation treaty, so they were sort of totally opposed to it. But I think the Indian community, among various other lobbies, also played a huge role. And I remember at the time I would do regular interviews with then Under Secretary of State Nicholas Burns, who was sort of the point terrorist who was co-opted into the administration, who was also part of the nuclear deal. And I was doing that and writing those op-eds and all that, not because I was sort of a lobbyist for either the administration or the Indian government, but because I felt that this issue, that nuclear issue, had been a real thorn and an impediment to the furthering of US-India relations. And of course, Ambassador Sen at the time was one of my best sources. We would talk 2 to 3 times a week, and I was very close to him. Unfortunately, this whole headless chicken issue came up. And for those who don't know the background about this whole headless chicken incident, I used to have a lot of background interviews with Ambassador Sen, but in one interview which I said was on the record, he said all these guys are running around like headless chickens and asking this and that and everything else. He really meant the journalists who were running around, and of course at the time the opposition was totally opposed to it, the nuclear deal, and it was more a case of political than any sort of real issue in terms of the substance of the deal. But what happened was poor Ronan Sen, the next day after my story appeared, there were blazing headlines saying Ronan Sen's called parliamentarians headless chickens. And there was angry debates in the parliament, and there were these blazing headlines which they brought to the parliament and started calling for Ronan Sen's neck. And they wanted him recalled, they pushed him in front of parliamentary committees and everything else, and of course, he was of course very mad with me, and he sort of said, why did you do it? I said, I didn't do anything, we had an interview and this is what happened. And in some ways it was unfortunate because the main issue that he spoke about and the main thrust of the interview was that there would be no credibility if India did not go through with this deal, because the US had invested so much into the deal, and then the administration had pushed it through and got India approval in the nuclear suppliers group, etc. But then in some ways, it was unfortunate because Ronan was really mad at me. I think his wife was even madder. Somebody said that if you run into Kalpana, she's going to squeeze your neck. But that's what happened, and then sort of my source dried up, But I guess these are the exigencies of the business. And I have to back up a bit because at the same time, earlier on, Raju had also had this great big battle with the Bachchans. This was really Amitabh Bachchan. And what happened was a Swedish newspaper called Dagens Nyheter carried a story saying that they had, Amitabh Bachchan had some involvement in the whole Bofors deal. And we used to have a news service called India Abroad News Service, which grew into a very powerful news service, and we had all the major newspapers in India which subscribed to it. And one of the newspapers, in fact Hindustan Times, carried the story that we had reported, essentially our London correspondent had reported on the Dagens Nyheter story. But the Bachchans put so much of pressure on the Swedish newspaper. They apologized, they retracted, they issued an apology, and they wanted Raju also, India Abroad, to also offer an apology. But like I said earlier, Raju was an uncompromising tough son of a bitch. He said, no way, I'm not going to apologize. This is something that we carried off another newspaper. But there was a libel case. We used to have an India Abroad London edition. And as you know, the libel laws are pretty tough in London. The Bachchans went and they sued, and there were damages running to about $100,000. But Raju refused to pay. So they came to the US to collect. And there were all these newspapers from the Washington Post, the New York Times, all the newspapers, ABC, NBC, all of them. They filed a friend of the court brief with India Abroad, and it was thrown out in court. And this, in fact, I think there are PhDs being doing on this now. And editor and publisher had a lead story and a cover story on this particular case. So that's, I'm trying to say that on one hand, here was the ethnic media, promoting India-US ties, getting the empowerment of Indian Americans, etc. But at the same time, there were times when we would have issues with the establishment because we wouldn't necessarily fall in line and simply become sort of a propaganda arm and write the stories they like to hear. We were always investigating, and there was another interesting time when, I wrote a story about then Ambassador Siddharth Shankar Ray, who was very close to Congressman Gary Ackerman, another New York Democrat, who was a powerful guy on the Senate, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And this was the time when there was a clamor for the Indian government to appoint a lobbyist. And Gary Ackerman, and I wrote saying that he laid the hand on Ambassador Siddharth Shankar Ray, and Gary Ackerman's friend, a guy called David Springer, got the lobbying contract. And then, of course, I remember I went away after writing that story on vacation, and I came back, and Gopal Raju said, you finally hit the big leagues, So I said, what happened, He said, you've been sued for $4 million and you got the money to pay for it. I said, are you kidding? I said, what happened? I said, Gary Ackerman and David Springer have sued you, saying that you wrote that Gary Ackerman laid the arm on Siddharth Shankar Ray, and this is how the lobbying contract came to pass. So I was wondering what the heck is going to happen, but Raju, one thing with Raju was he would back you to the hilt. Even if you screwed up, he would back you, and that's why he was sort of a pioneering, hard-nosed publisher and uncompromising. He said, okay, after he had a good laugh, and he seemed to get some sort of a perverse delight that we've really been, he really was serious, saying you finally hit the big league, you've been sued for $4 million. He said he always used to know who the best media lawyer in town was. And I still remember he got me to go and meet Laura Handman in Washington, D.C. She charged like some $1,000 for half an hour or whatever. But then she wrote a letter to Gary Ackerman, wrote a letter to David Springer, and that was the end of it. Because I think when she said, okay, they are going to have Discovery and everything else, Gary Ackerman and David Springer didn't want any editors coming out of their projects. But finally, the two examples I will talk about is one when India Abroad was able to crystallize and empower the Indian American community to come together in terms of the F-16 issue. There was a huge demonstration on Capitol Hill. Solars and lots of, at the time during the Cold War years, a few pro-India congressmen, lawmakers made strong opposition to the F-16s being sold to Pakistan, saying that it could destabilize the region, etc. And all of us know that some of those equipment and sophisticated equipment was used against India. So that was an example at a time during the Cold War where there was an ethnic newspaper getting the community involved, empowering them, getting them to buttonhole their congressmen, senators, explain to them why this sale was different. And even though the sale went through, I think that was one time when the community all came together. Because unlike a lot of guys always talk about the fact that why can't Indians be like the Jewish community? Why can't they all come together? Because they fight and they have all their problems like the Indian American community among themselves. But when it comes to Israel, they are all there together. But the problem is India is not sort of a homogeneous whole like when it comes to Israel, which is one particular foreign policy issue. You would find congressmen saying, people going and talking about why these two democracies should come together, etc. But he says, but there was just another group who came and they were Indians, but they were attacking India and talking about human rights violations and all that. So you had the Council of Palestine, you had the Kashmiri American Council, all talking to these guys, and these guys were totally confused as to what the whole issue was. And then the other issue, where in a lot of ways, India Abroad led the way in terms of talking about why that US-India civilian nuclear deal was important. Not so much as just the sale of nuclear reactors, but because it was going to take an impediment away in terms of bringing both countries together in terms of a strategic partnership. This was yet another example of where the US-India role was promoted in terms of the ethnic media. And finally, before I end, I must also say that there have been times when India Abroad has scooped even the New York Times and the Washington Post on quite a few occasions. An example was, I remember when Clinton was going on the eve of Clinton's trip in March 2000 to South Asia. This was just the time that Musharraf had deposed Nawaz Sharif as Prime Minister in a bloodless coup. And of course, it's interesting that it's come full circle now. But at the time, there was going to be the trip to South Asia, and legislatively, by US law, it barred anyone, any administration from having relations with a country that had deposed the democracy in a coup. And of course the Secret Service had also advised Clinton against going to Pakistan. And that was clearly from a security angle, not the politics or the strategic reasons or whatever. So it was going to be a South Asia trip, no Pakistan. But I remember we got the story that he was going to make a stopover in Pakistan for 8 hours, even though he spent 5 days in India. But in some ways it showed that sometimes the more things change, the more things remain the same. Because even though they were in some ways violating US laws, I guess Pakistan, that mindset was still there, that it was sort of some strategically important, that he still had to go and meet General Musharraf, the dictator at the time. And so I remember being on the White House press delegation, and it was very interesting because from Mumbai we were flying into this air base in Pakistan. And then all of us press guys were put into one of these C-17 military planes, and they said, okay, you guys head first, you know. President Clinton will follow on Air Force One later, you know. Probably they thought that, you know, because the Stinger missiles now were in the hands of the Al-Qaeda guys, that, okay, let's send the press guys first in case they send up one of those missiles. You know, you get rid of these guys who are a nuisance to us anyway. But it was very interesting. But we land in this Air Force base, and it's amazing how the advanced teams travel with the president, and they've got little miniature Air Force Ones, you know, small little planes that look like Air Force One. And there was this, so we were all waiting. Of course, we had escaped the Stinger missiles, we landed safely, and now we were waiting for Clinton to arrive. And then, of course, there was this Pakistani announcer at the air base, and then there was this Air Force One looking little plane that was landing, and there was this real silver-haired guy who got down. And the announcer said, oh, the President of the United States is here, the President is here. Of course, that was a decoy, you know, it was the Secret Service guy getting off, you know. And then, of course, Air Force One lands, and the President, and he said, oh, the President is here again, the President is here again. So those were memorable experiences. But the fact that he had gone to Pakistan, once again, like I said, sometimes reminds you that the more things change in Washington in a way, the more things remain the same. So the basic point being that the ethnic media has had a role in the India-US relationship. And I predict that it will continue to grow as sort of the Indian-American community has grown exponentially in terms of influence, gravitas, and presence in the mainstream community. And this will be not just in terms of covering politics, diplomacy, or trade, which is going to be the catalyst in any future India-US relationship, but in a whole host of areas, culture, education, and all kinds of other non-traditional areas that we've been used to. And it may not necessarily be in the print format. It could be in a whole lot of other formats, you know, digital, online, etc. But definitely the role of the ethnic media, and in the case of the Indian ethnic media playing a role in terms of the US-India relationship cannot be dismissed. And I think it has a role for it in the future. Thank you very much.
We're going to make this more of a conversation because the two of us are old friends, and it just makes more sense on a Friday night.
Absolutely.
If you're joining us.
Absolutely.
So I want to begin with an observation, which of course is about my own life. When I worked at the Washington Post, which is when I ran into you all the time, I wrote a column for India Abroad. And I got more feedback on those columns for India Abroad than when I would write a front page story for the Washington Post. And I just want to understand, why do you think that is?
Well, I think that's that has to do with, I guess, and
should we just hand it back and forth? You want to do that? Here.
I'm sure that most of that feedback probably came from the Indian American community, from the South Asian American community, because to them, and even now the older generation, what matters is much more that something appears in India abroad, which they can discuss among the community, among their friends and the older generation, who have been lifetime subscribers of India abroad, and in a sense have also grown up with India abroad. So it is to be expected that when you write for the Washington Post, it's more sort of the mainstream community that reads your piece. But in terms of when you do that piece for India abroad, there is a parochial element to it, no doubt. But the fact that these are the discussions they have when they get their weekly issue of India abroad, and any provocative column or investigative column or any column that has to do with politics or diplomacy or trade or religion or the community has more feedback in terms of their own interaction. So it was natural that you got much more feedback from the Indian American community in terms of the column you did for India abroad than for the Post.
So that's a little bit of a leading question, because I wonder, as the narrative of the last 10 years or so, since I was writing those columns, as well as when I was a print reporter for the Washington Post, has very much been of a media in decline. And if you look at the ethnic press, it's one of growth, right? Last year, I think 21 ethnic newspapers across the country launched, whereas between, I have a statistic here actually, by 2011, you saw about 100 newspapers close in the previous decade, between 2000 and 2011, mainstream or so-called mainstream newspapers. Is something about what you just described, advocating for a community, situating yourself among a community, are there lessons to be learned from the broader slowdown in mainstream media?
Well, I think to a great extent, let's face it, print media is on the decline. Venerable newspapers like the Chicago Tribune, Philadelphia Inquirer, newspapers that have been around, mainstream newspapers for like hundreds of years, are going bankrupt. Just imagine Jeff Bezos buying a Washington Post for $250 million. If he had come a few years ago and offered that to the Washington Post, they would have run him out of town. This is just chump change for the Washington Post. So let's face it, print media is on the decline, and we have also been suffering sort of the vicissitudes of this whole internet online boom that has sort of in a way been so crippling to the print media. But I would say it's more, when you talk about the growth of ethnic media, it's the language papers in the ethnic media in the US that has been growing exponentially, because as sort of an extended family comes, the older parents, maybe those who are not as fluent in English, etc., those newspapers, even among Indian language papers, have been growing, and that's the same in India. These papers are just growing by leaps and bounds. But it's a tough ride now. It's become very tough, and in a lot of ways, India abroad was fortunate because we were acquired by Rediff.com, which is one of the largest news portals in India, and we have our own digital edition now. So there is the digital edition as well as the print edition. But let's face it, in a way, a lot of our old subscribers are literally dying. So circulation is dropping.
Can we just stay on that point as far as what the future of India abroad is, as far as targeting a second generation of readers as well as the newcomers? How do you do both of those things?
It's a tough ride. That's really tough because just to give you an example, even an old-timer like me, I used to subscribe to 5 newspapers in the earlier days, Washington Post, New York Times, Christian Science Monitor, Wall Street Journal, etc. But now I read them all online. So if a guy like me who needed his Washington Post every morning with his cup of tea, etc., is reading it online, the kids today, they just aren't reading newspapers at all. And we are trying so hard to get to that next generation. And we have a superb magazine edition, and from being India-centric, we've become very Indian-American-centric, which is only natural because there is a second and a third and now a fourth generation. And we write all these great profiles about the great things the kids are doing, etc. And the guy would call you up and say, Aziz, could you send me a PDF, please? And I say, what the heck, man? We had so many pages on you. Can't you at least buy that particular edition? So it is a tough ride because it's a new world out there in terms of print. And we are trying hard to reach out to the generation, but it's going to be a tough ride because let's face it, if people like you and me are reading a lot of stuff online and not reading newspapers as we used to, the kids of today, the second generation, etc., they are reading stuff today on their iPhones, and just all these sound bites.
So I'll confess that I actually don't have a subscription to India Abroad.
There you go. Yeah.
I actually, and when something important is in it, my mother-in-law will send me the PDF from the website, which, say what you think, it's not the ideal way for me to be reading that article. Anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that I'm constantly posting things from the Aerogram, and Lakshmi Gandhi, the editor of the Aerogram, is actually here tonight. And I'm constantly saying, why doesn't India Abroad just buy the Aerogram? I mean, it's a online site that's very much targeting second and third generation readers. It's just a segue to kind of ask you how much those stories are appearing in the main India Abroad edition as opposed to the weekly magazine that you talked about, and also from a talent perspective, the reporters that you're hiring, are you getting second generation Indian Americans who want to come work for you?
Well, we've had a few young people who've come and worked, who've done internships, who've come and worked for a few years, but a lot of them are trying to make India Abroad into a stepping stone into getting into perhaps mainstream journalism, or even getting into some of these very popular sites and other online editions, etc. And that's something we have no problems with. In fact, this was something that even the founder of India Abroad, Gopal Raju, had no problem with, because there was a time when Raju had something going with Columbia University and also the New York Times, where there would be journalists who would be given a scholarship for a master's journalism at Columbia, and Raju would fund them to a certain extent and also get them to come and work at India Abroad. And a lot of them, from Pranay Gupte to a lot of others, even one of our editors, Arul Lewis, went off to work for Gannett, then was a news editor at New York Daily News, etc. So that's something to be expected. I think you will find young people coming, working for us, doing internships, getting networking, using India Abroad to meet people, get community people involved, because there are huge stories. And as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, so there are huge local sort of profiles, etc., that they can do, and they can network using India Abroad and the kind of sources and networks that it has. But I don't think you're going to find a lot of them trying to make a career at India Abroad, right, because it's a whole new world out there.
Why did you make it a career? Did you come in the 80s thinking you were going to stay there 30 years? And talk a little bit about what's kept you there, and if it's the commitment to ethnic media, as you just spoke of.
That's an interesting question. In a lot of ways, one is that I just love being in Washington. I didn't want to move away from Washington. In fact, there could have been opportunities to getting into the mainstream, but of course I loved the fact that I could remain in Washington, because of course if I had gone to a newspaper like the Washington Post or New York Times, and I had done international relations, political science, and international reporting was my forte, I would have been posted anywhere in the world and I would have to go, and then Washington would have been the last time. And then of course India Abroad gave me the opportunity to cover not just the politics and diplomacy, but I could cover, you know, the doctors' convention, the hoteliers' convenience store conventions, and a whole panoply of things which I loved. So you are not getting buttonholed into one particular beat, which is something that burns out a lot of people. And then again, I loved being in Washington, and then I didn't want to move out of there. In fact, there was a time when Gopal Raju was getting on in years. He was now in his almost reaching 80, and he was looking around and trying to find sort of a board of trustees that could run India Abroad. And finally, of course, he met with Ajit Balakrishnan, and they really gelled. And that's how Rediff acquired India Abroad. But before that, I remember him telling one day, Aziz, why don't you come over here and become the publisher of India Abroad? And I said, are you kidding me? He was offering me all kinds of perks and virtually telling me, I said, I don't know anything about publishing. He said, you can go to school and learn. But I think in a way, it was just sort of the DNA and the fact that I wanted to run around and do the kind of reporting I did. And also I would say, hey, throw anything at me, you know, politics, diplomacy, religion, doctors, hoteliers, everything. And in a way, I think that energized me. And I guess in a lot of ways, I got involved with the community. I started knowing people in the community. I had known them for years, and they would give me leads. They would give me all kinds of stories. Then I developed a network in Washington. And that's the reason I sort of found that it was a great ride. And it's been almost 30 years with India Abroad, and it's still a hell of a ride.
So you mentioned the hoteliers and the doctors' conventions, and a stereotype, if you will, is that India Abroad is the publication of the spelling bee winners and the doctors, and occasionally the hoteliers and maybe the gas station attendants. Talk about how coverage is designed every week, as well as who it's for. Is it for the affluent Indian? Is it for the overall community? Is that even a discussion that happens in the newsroom?
Absolutely, absolutely. It may have started as, in a way, catering to sort of the elite, because it was sort of the professional elite who were the first wave of immigrants. You know, it was the doctors, the engineers, the scientists, etc. But as the community evolved and the extended family came over, and you had guys working in sort of blue-collar jobs for the franchises of the McDonald's, the Dunkin' Donuts, and everything else, we make it a point to cover all facets of the community, bar none. And we don't discriminate in any way. It's not an elitist newspaper. Of course, a lot of the doctors and the engineers and the IT guys who were that first wave are a core circulation base for us. But as you would know, we've in fact, you know, Bharavi Desai, who's a taxi driver, who is the sort of spokesman for the cabbies of South Asian descent, etc. And there were a whole heap of others who have been India Abroad Person of the Year awardees, and we cover them extensively. So I think we are not discriminatory in any way, or it's sort of an elitist newspaper. I think over the years, as the community has evolved and the extended community has started getting into a whole lot of other industries, you know, we cover the hoteliers convention, and we've seen them grow from just the Patel motels to what they are today. You have the Clintons, the Bob Doles, and everybody else who are their keynote speakers. And these guys have grown not just horizontally but vertically today. So in the same way, the doctors. So those are conventions that we cover. But at the same time, for instance, a few years back, I went to Tampa to cover the South Asian convenience store owners. And these are guys who own the 7-Elevens, the gas stations, and everything else. And that was what a stimulating convention it was. And also it was so inspiring covering these guys, because these guys had just come through working at a 7-Eleven or a gas station to owning these gas stations, and some of these guys owning, like, you know, thousands of gas stations. So I think in that sense, we've tried to be as wholesome as we can in terms of covering the entire gamut of the community.
Right. So because I don't get the paper, I did ask my mother-in-law about the number of bylines you had this week. And the reason I did that was because I perhaps should have prefaced all of my questions by saying you're not only one of the most prolific journalists in ethnic media, but probably one of the most prolific journalists in the country. And so she told me that on July 11th, the edition, you had 7 bylines, and July 18th, you had 5. So maybe this week you had something going on.
Yeah, I slacked a bit.
You slacked a little bit. How do you do that? What is the sourcing like? You've talked about interviewing presidents. Is it really that easy for them to grant an interview to the reporter from India abroad? And then just kind of on a process, how do you write 7 stories a week? And in some weeks, I know it's been more than that.
Yeah, that must have been a slow week. One is, I guess, like my nephews and nieces tell me, get a life. So that's one major reason. The other is it's probably a sort of part of the DNA, sort of the adrenaline keeps pumping, and I think it helps also the fact that I don't get myself buttonholed into one particular beat. So it makes it more exciting to cover a very interesting diplomatic story as well as a very community-based story, which should have so much of human interest, etc. And also, it's not absolutely not being an ethnic newspaper, getting some of these interviews with presidents, senators, and all that is not easy at all. In fact, if I were to call up the White House or the State Department and say I want to, they'll say, okay, put your application in and we'll call you back in about 10 years' time. In a lot of ways, it's the interaction with the community and the growth of the community, and the fact that there have been guys who've become very strong political activists who have been able to get access to some of these congressmen, senators, presidents, etc. And the fact that they feel that India abroad is one vehicle where they can express and bring up issues of concern. It is to their vested interest also to help me in terms of getting an interview, for instance. Okay. And for instance, I remember there was this very powerful doctor in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale, called Zachariah, who was very, very close to the Bush family. And he was instrumental in helping me, getting me this interview with first Daddy Bush, George H.W. Bush, and then also George W. Bush. And I still remember at the time, that was the time that John Kerry was also running for the presidency, but he was doing pretty badly in the polls. And there would be some of the Boston Indian Americans who would call me and say, Aziz, why don't you interview John Kerry? And I would say, oh no, he sort of doesn't have a chance and all that. I've interviewed him when he was chairman of the when he was a member of the Foreign Relations Committee and all that. But then what happened was, when he suddenly perked and got the nomination and became the nominee, it became very hard to get that interview. But then I was able to get an interview with George H.W. Bush. And then, of course, naturally, he gave his point of view, the Republican, what he was going to do in terms of India-US relations, etc. And this, in a way, played well, because then the Democrats thought that it is to their advantage, and they got to get an interview with India abroad. So there back-to-back interviews with John F. Kerry when he was running for the president. So in a lot of ways, it has worked with the influence of the Indian American community. And also, in the early years, a lot of the doctors were sort of the family doctors to some of the most powerful senators and congressmen, Guys would always say, do you know that Dr. So-and-so, he's my family doctor. A good example was a doctor in Las Vegas called Dr. R.D. Prabhu, who was the family doctor to Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. And if I were to call Harry Reid's office and say, I want to interview the Senate Majority Leader, they would, like I said, call back in 5 years. But I would call Dr. Prabhu and say, I want to interview Harry Reid, and then Harry Reid calls me in the afternoon and says, Doc is on my case, he wants me to speak to you. So in a way, that's been very helpful, because otherwise an ethnic newspaper, no way could they have got the kinds of interviews we've done over the years.
Yeah. That's amazing. Just lightning round, who is the best president for India so far that you've covered? I'm holding the mic just to make sure it's okay. Answer.
Yeah, let me try to be as diplomatic as possible. Some could argue that Republicans have been better, even though some of them have been myopic in terms of India-U.S. relations, particularly Cold War years. Some would really point to sort of the Reagan years and talk about the fact that the real scientific and technology initiatives were begun during that years. Then guys would point to George W. Bush and say, hey, for everything he did, he was the guy who pushed through the nuke deal, and there were a lot of the bureaucracy in the State Department and elsewhere that were not for the deal at all, but he told Condoleezza Rice, I don't care about anything, you make this happen. So I think it could be argued both ways. Democrats during those Kennedy years, people would say was a great era, because here was a family that understood India and things like that. So that's a tough question in the sense that you couldn't pinpoint and say, because there have been times when perhaps a Republican administration seemed to be better for India-US relations, and there were times when Democratic administrations may have moved the ball further. But I think in a lot of ways now it's almost a given that India-US relations will only evolve because there is bipartisanship in the Congress and even in the administration that this is a relationship that has to be fostered. And one of the reasons, for instance, that now the administration is going on overdrive, because there was a perception that sort of a malaise had set forth, and that India-US relations were not moving forward as they should have. So I think you're going to have John Kerry going later this month to have the strategic dialogue with India. Then Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel is going to India in August. And so sort of they're setting the tone for Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US and for his summit with President Obama.
So we've focused a lot on the US looking towards India and US-India relations, kind of the geopolitical side of them. You said India Abroad's also trying to focus on the Indian American community and the up-and-comers, and I just wondered if you have any thoughts on the rise of the Indian American politician. Of course, here in New York City we have Preet Bharara, who's an appointed office, but nonetheless, and of course Bobby Jindal, who I believe you've covered closely, and Nikki Haley, for example. Is there something to the Indianness that is propelling, the increase of Indian American politicians, and also what is your access with those candidates like?
Yeah, I've had great access to Bobby Jindal and Nikki Haley, and this, of course, I guess is, some may argue, sort of two of the ironies and something that Republicans can point to and say, look, we've got Indian Americans, who are governors in the South. But that's a huge, huge story for another day, because there are a whole lot of other factors that went into it. But I think it's a natural phenomenon that Indian Americans today, moving out of traditional fields, are getting into public service, are getting into politics. In fact, in the Washington area in Maryland, Kumar Barway is the House Majority Leader, and he's the longest serving Indian American and the first ever state legislator to be elected. And now we've got Dr. Ami Bera in Congress. And so I think it's going to evolve. There have been a lot of Indian Americans who've come pretty close, but I guess there may be a time, I guess maybe in 10 years, where we are probably going to have a couple more congressmen, senators, not senators, at least a few U.S. representatives, and maybe a senator. But it's interesting that you find Bobby Jindal, who is a very, very strategic politician, and Nikki Haley in the South, who've been, and in a lot of ways are very conservative Republicans, which a lot of Indian Americans have problems dealing with in terms of their policies on, women's right to choose, in terms of immigration, etc. But nonetheless, have done pretty well as being strategic politicians in being able to both get a lot of funding and contributions from the Indian Americans, at the same time hold on to some of their their conservative quote-unquote values, which a lot of Indians themselves have problems dealing with. So I think not only are these guys being elected, but they're also showing sort of a lot of subtle sophistication, etc., in terms of establishing themselves. First in terms of getting Indian American funding and then moving into sort of mainstream support for their candidacies.
So I know I'm probably keeping the last thing between you and dinner, but...
And maybe if the audience has any questions.
The audience has questions. I think we have like 5 minutes or so, about 5-10 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Before we turn to the audience, I just have one question that I would kill myself if I didn't ask you. It's India abroad, but you're actually Sri Lankan, right?
Yeah.
It's out. You're out as a Sri Lankan.
Yes.
How did you end up in the United States? Because this is, of course, the root of it is the diaspora story. So how did you end up here, and how did a Sri Lankan end up doing so well at India abroad?
Yeah, this is an interesting backstory. One is my coming to the US was sort of a natural evolution. I have we are 5 boys in our family, 4 of whom are in the US. So a couple of my brothers were doctors who had also come in the 70s. And so I happened to come.
So they were almost Indian.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So came, visited with them, then started going to college here, went to graduate school, and then of course joined India Abroad. And how I joined India Abroad and how a Sri Lankan came to be, first working for India Abroad and then working for them for this long. Gopal Raju used to have a long-time friend in a Sri Lankan journalist called Talif Deen, who is one of the most distinguished Sri Lankan journalists at the UN. He is the editor-in-chief and the UN bureau chief for Interpress Service. And Gopal Raju had already had India Abroad. It was doing very well for about 10-15 years. And he started a newspaper called Asian Monitor, where he wanted to get South Asians also involved. So he wanted to get Sri Lankans, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and it was very interesting. At the time that he started, there was a Pakistani guy called Sadat Rizvi, and he had access to General Zia. He had General Zia's phone number, personal phone number. So we had a couple of exclusive interviews with General Zia at the time. But what happened was Asian Monitor couldn't get a foothold. In fact, Gopal Raju probably spent like about $500,000 trying to promote Asian Monitor. But the Indian community was the only community that could sustain an ethnic newspaper. And they already had India Abroad. So a lot of stuff that Asian Monitor would write still had sort of the South Asian content. The Pakistanis, of course, even though we were trying to be as objective as possible, they probably had a suspicion, hey, an Indian publisher with Asian Monitor, we needn't subscribe to it. The Sri Lankans were happy as hell, but they were too small to sustain a newspaper. So Asian Monitor folded up. But I started writing for India Abroad, so I kept on with India Abroad. And of course, how I came to be with India Abroad was when he started Asian Monitor, he was looking for somebody from Sri Lanka and all the Asian countries. And he had spoken to his friend Talif Deen at the UN and said, do you know of anyone? And I was just completing my master's degree. I had not even finished it at George Washington University. And I started writing for India Abroad while I was still a college student. And I never got a resume together. I just started stringing for India Abroad, and the rest is sort of history.
Wow. So let's open it up. Remember, we don't have a lot of time, so just keep your remarks or questions very brief, and please do identify yourself. I'm going to hand the mic over to Aziz, and he'll call on you.
Yeah, go ahead, sir. Yeah.
My question is with respect to the Indo-US nuclear deal. As you have been said, Helen, that Ambassador Donald Sen, as well as Gopal Raju, both were protagonists for this deal to happen. I think the foundation stone for this deal was laid when Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the Prime Minister, and his second in command, Lal Krishna Advani, was invited over to the US, and the US promptly put the seed in him, which germinated later on, and then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh his own baby, Do you have any idea that it was initially discussed and initiated with Mr. Lalkrishnan Advani?
Yes, I would agree with you. But even though the seed was planted, it did not germinate till President George W. Bush, to his credit, started running with it. Because even though the seed had been planted, like I mentioned, there were so many people in the bureaucracy and so many of these non-proliferationists, in various agencies in the government who did not want this deal to go through, because their argument was that India was not a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that there was no way you could have a deal with a country that was not a member of the NPT. But like I said, George W. Bush, and it was very interesting, I had an interview with Robert Blackwell, who was George W. Bush's ambassador in India, and he told me that George W. Bush had once told him, 1 billion people, wow, and a democracy. He just was trying to wrap his hands around that concept, that here was a country with 1 billion people and it was still a functioning, growing democracy. And I think to a great extent, whatever arguments we have with George W. Bush in terms of foreign policy, in terms of Iraq, in terms of Afghanistan, etc., I think it was he who said and told Condoleezza Rice, I know there are a lot of people in your State Department who don't want this to happen, but I want it to happen. So I think the germination started when George W. Bush went running with the ball, and that was the time that Ronan Sen was the ambassador. So he was in the forefront of that deal. Go ahead, sir.
The point is that a little bit before, Consulate was talking about the reporting in the New York Times, and we actually noticed it every other day. The long reports citing one after another negatives of India that are coming. But at the same time, our own media, ethnic media, do not really express the good points of India. Suppose they are trying to show that pluralism or secularism is not in prevalence in India. They made critical remarks, but I have hardly seen in any ethnic media they are showing that one of 9 points they are saying minority oppression in India. But a single minority family or themselves have gone to Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or any other country in India. But this message, so what is happening? There is a sense of guilt is being instilled by the ethnic media in the minds of the general people. That is working as a part, working as a factor not to be attracted to the Indian ethnic media newspapers. And at the same time, they are talking of secularism too much and making India as the role model to experiment secularism, but they are not talking about total kind of Islamism or the Islamic states of the world, 56 countries. But any kind of small infraction by India is being very much looked at. Is there any way that it should be neutralized?
I would strongly disagree with that contention, sir. I think to a certain extent, we definitely highlight all the positives of India, the positives of Indians, the positives of Indian Americans. In fact, for the last 12 years, we have something called the India Abroad Person of the Year Awards, where we highlight some of the greatest things and some of the highlights of Indian Americans and what they have achieved, etc. And we also, in fact, have also instituted an award called the Friend of India Award to people who've been trying to foster India-US relations. But at the same time, to be credible, you got to report, and you got to report on the whole panoply of things that are happening. And you made the fact that the ethnic media is reporting on a lot of negatives, but that's you got to report everything red in tooth and claw. There are the positives, there are the negatives, and I think this is the greatness of India, because in India today you get one of the most feisty media outlets
who do some of the best investigative journalism, etc. And I think that's very important for terms of objectivity, because if you just keep reporting on all the positives and don't even talk about the negatives, then you lose your credibility, and then you could become just an organ of either one agency or the other. So I think I would take exception to your contention. True, there is definitely a whole lot of things that happens in the United States. I agree with you. Sometimes the New York Times, they wouldn't highlight some of the positives. They probably only lately started doing some of the very good growth economic stories in terms of India's growth, of course, during the first administration of the Manmohan Singh government, but they would focus on something else. But then and again, there is one point where some issues are not sexy issues, some are sexy issues. So they would rather go into the village somewhere and do a story that could be perceived as negative. But I think to a great extent, all of us try our best to be as objective and credible as possible, and then try to write about the positives as well as the negatives. But if you only start writing about the positives and don't focus or don't bring out some of the negatives that are happening, then we would lose credibility. No one would believe them. They would say, hey, we know these guys have this particular line, and that's all we can expect from them. So I think to a certain extent it's very important, I think, to be as objective as possible.
I think we have time for one more question if there's any out there.
Yes, I have the mic.
Yeah.
So this is Rupi Bhani, and I'm actually a software engineer by profession and digital artist by passion. So last year, while setting up a cultural exhibition on Diwali and Eid in Bank of America, I found that there are 3 stamps, US postage stamps, which are actually published by United States, and those were probably published in 2005, 11, and 13. So, unfortunately, I didn't see that there is any postage stamp on Diwali. So, my question is like, what kind of role is being played by ethnic media in this aspect? Because to me, definitely it was a matter of pride. Then I finally consoled myself saying that no, I'm a global citizen. So, but I would like to know like what kind of role is being played by ethnic media in this matter.
We've played a pretty huge role, and I must say all the other ethnic media has also played a huge role, and I agree with you. There definitely has to be a Diwali stamp because there have been stamps for Kavanza, for Eid, and a whole lot of other festivals of other communities, etc. And I think the ethnic media for a long time, India abroad, in fact, there is a doctor called Shalendra Kumar who's been involved in this issue for like over 10 years, and the Ambassador Mule himself and Congresswoman Caroline Maloney have introduced legislation. There is a whole critical mass among US lawmakers who have been pushing for this, writing to the postmaster. But the thing is, he has autonomy in terms of making that judgment. So that's where it lies, but it's not for the lack of coverage, not for the lack of interviews, not for the lack of even a lot of US congressmen and senators who said that time is long past where there should have been a Diwali stamp. So your point is very well taken. This should have happened yesterday, not sometime in the future, but they also say that all they can do is they can write letters to the Postmaster General, they can say that how come this hasn't happened, but that's an issue that we have to keep fighting till it becomes a reality.
So we've gone from postage stamps to F-16s to the nuclear deal to Bobby Jindal to Bill Clinton and many other luminaries. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey, Aziz. There are 2 things I think that would bring me back to the consulate here. One, of course, is when we celebrate the month of Assam. And today I'm going to implore the Honorable Consul General to add Sri Lanka to the list of celebrations, because they've lent us somebody who is so committed to India, and we are so, so grateful. So thank you, Aziz Haniffa.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated Ambassador Mule for inviting me. Thank you.
Well, please give a big hand. What an impressive. It's been a revealing you, and I have revealed it. Rarely do we have such an insight, not only in the newspaper, but also the person who has been associated with the newspaper. And we're extremely privileged and delighted to have had this evening's presentation, because we went on a journey of sorts, both your journey, the India abroad journey, and visionaries. Sometimes many of these visionaries, and it needs to be told, because these stories need to come before that. I don't think you always cover these aspects when you do your weekly columns or features. So it's been really wonderful. You have thrown light on the role of ethnic media, and I think it's perhaps the best example. And some point of time you need to take time out to write about this. Can be a subject of an independent book, the role of India abroad, in universal relations. And who better than you? So thank you very much for doing all that you have done this evening. And Vidra, I think very, very solid questions. And it's good that we know that you are our neighbor, and in fact, one of my activity towards the second half of this year is going to be a SAR seminar at the Consulate, where we try and get experts on SAR in New York and maybe in USA, and we do a solid seminar here. But I think it's as much important that we all do these smaller conversations all over the world to take our own regional dialogue forward. And Prime Minister Modi has set a very good tone at the time of inaugural, invited all the SARC leaders for his inaugural. So thank you very much. Once again, 2 announcements. Our next event is on 23rd. Only a few days back,